One chilling night in October, Emma found herself standing before the eerie gates of Hollywood Manor. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. The air was thick with an unsettling silence, broken only by the distant howl of a lone wolf. Emma's heart raced, but she couldn't ignore the pull that drew her closer to the looming mansion. Legends whispered of the restless spirits that haunted its halls, their stories woven into the very fabric of the old decaying walls. As she stepped through the creaking gate, Emma's footsteps echoed off the cobblestones, filling the night with their lonely rhythm. The front door groaned open, revealing a grand foyer, its once opulent decor now shrouded in dust and decay. With every step, Emma felt the weight of the house's history settle around her. Shadows danced in the corners of her vision, and ghostly whispers seemed to beckon from hidden chambers. Yet she pressed on, driven by a curiosity that refused to be stifled. Up the winding staircase she went, her fingers trailing along the tattered wallpaper. She reached the corridor veiled in darkness, and the flicker of an ancient candle sputtered to life, casting an eerie glow upon the passage. Emma's breath hitched as she heard a faint melody, hauntingly beautiful, drifting through the air. It led her to a forgotten parlor where an ethereal pianist played a tune that seemed to bridge the gap between the living and the departed. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice barely rising above the melancholy melody. The pianist turned, their face shrouded in shadow, but Emma sensed a bittersweet smile in their presence. "I am the soul who cannot leave, bound to this house by the weight of unfinished dreams." As the notes hung in the air, Emma felt a sorrow that permeated the very walls. She yearned to help to release this tormented spirit from its eternal prison. With determination in her heart, Emma embarked on a quest to uncover the secrets that bound the pianist to Hollywood Manor. She delved into old letters and journals, unraveling a tale of lost love and unfulfilled promises. Weeks passed, each day bringing her closer to the truth. And then one fateful night, as the moon hung low in the sky, Emma stood in the parlor clutching an old, weathered letter. She read aloud the words that had been hidden for so long, and as the final note of the haunting melody filled the air, the room seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, the spirit before her transformed, bathed in a gentle light. With a serene smile, they whispered, "Thank you, Emma. You have freed me from my eternal lament." And just like that, the specter faded, leaving behind a sense of peace that permeated the very essence of Hollywood Manor. Emma stepped out into the night, the once haunted house now filled with inexplicable warmth. As she looked back at the old mansion, she knew that she had been part of something extraordinary, a bridge between two worlds, bound by the magic of Halloween.
It was my turn to take the kids trick-or-treating. The previous year it was my wife's, and we trade back and forth every year. My son and daughter are aged 7 and 9. Usually I stay on the street while my kids go up to the different houses to collect candy. After about half an hour of walking around, we came to one of the more popular hotspots for candy collecting, a main street in the neighborhood. Lots of really cool decorations and animatronics on people's lawns. So I became a bit distracted and stopped watching my kids as closely. At one point, they came back from a house accompanied by another girl about the same height as my daughter. She was wearing a weird, homemade mask, like a cardboard cutout or something. My daughter asked me if she could trick-or-treat with us, so I said sure, and we carried on together as a group. I didn't know who this girl was, but I figured she was a friend from my daughter's school. As we continued, I started to notice a large man trailing us. He was wearing some sort of angry cat mask, and it was kinda creepy, to be honest. I thought that maybe he was the father of the girl, so I tried to start up some small chat with him. I said something along the lines of, "Nice weather, eh?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me while our kids went up the stairs to the next house. I tried again, asking, "Hey, is that your daughter?" He nodded, but didn't say anything. I figured he just wasn't in the mood for chatting, so I stopped trying. We carried on for about another 15 minutes until suddenly my kids came up to me and said that they wanted to go home. This surprised me, as we hadn't been out for too long and their bags were only about a third full. In any case, I agreed. I waved goodbye at the man in the cat mask and his daughter, and we started on our way home. The weird thing is that when I glanced back at the man and his daughter, they were just standing there still, staring at us. I checked one more time as we turned the corner, and they were still standing there, not having moved at all. At this point, I decided to ask my kids, "So, who was that girl?" My daughter looked up at me with a confused look on her face. "She's your friend," my daughter replied. I asked her what she meant by that. Well, apparently, the girl with the cardboard mask approached my kids and said that she was a friend of mine. She told my daughter she was too shy to ask me if she could join us to trick-or-treat and wanted my daughter to ask me instead. I laughed at this story and replied to my daughter, "Why would you think she was my friend? I don't have any children friends." What my daughter said next chilled my bones. According to her, when the girl with the cardboard mask approached them for the first time, she wasn't wearing the mask, so they were able to see her face. As it turns out, she wasn't a girl at all, but an older woman around my age with wrinkles on her face. What's even more disturbing, the old woman had started to steal treats from my daughter's bag, apparently when I wasn't looking. This is why they asked me to go home. The old woman was really creeping them out and they just wanted to get away from her. I brought my kids home and I told my wife what happened. We made sure to check through all their candy, but didn't find anything suspicious or off. We didn't call the police or anything since nothing really happened, but thinking back, I kind of regret that decision now. What the heck was that old woman doing, and who the hell was that man following us around? I don't think I'll ever know. I just think it's sick that there are people out there on Halloween hiding behind masks, pretending to be children.
Come on, Jackie. Only kids like you have to be brave because they have no big brothers or big sisters to protect them. Daddy's words repeated in my head, and I swallowed before trying again. My feet shook as they made their way up the creaky wooden steps. A layer of fog rolled and twirled around my legs, illuminated by orange lights that shone from fires held within the devil's faces. One step howled loudly, catching me off guard and forcing me to hurry back down to the safety of the stone path below. Though it wasn't too much better down here, there were wispy skeletons moving about, and when one reached for me, I was hurried back onto the steps. This time my climb was greeted by a door opening. There was no bright, welcoming light that rushed to escape into the night. Rather, only tiny little bulbs of purple and green and orange shone within the darkness, and nothing more. Only when the shadow hurried forth did I scream and stumble back yet again, my suspense broken by the approaching figure. "Well, hello there," the creature spoke. My lip quivered and I was unable to respond. Its pale white face shook me deeply, standing out entirely on its own from the large black cloak it wore. "What do you say?" Was all I could muster before running from the house. A pair of arms interrupted my escape, quickly grabbing my fairy princess dress and hoisting me upwards. "Oh, there, Jacqueline," Uncle Hugh whispered, rubbing my back slowly as I cried out. Tears ran down my frightened face for the millionth time tonight, ruining any remaining makeup Mommy had put on. Uncle Hugh then did something that made me freeze up in terror. He called out to the monster, "Do you think you could come out here? She's a little frightened." My heart started to race rapidly as I heard footsteps clicking along the pathway behind me. I thrust my eyes into my uncle's shoulder, trying to hide from the beast, but when he told me to look, I was turned around to meet it once more. My cries echoed through the neighborhood once again as the monster laughed, its pearly white fangs matching perfectly with its face. "Oh, I'm sorry, dearie. Here, have some extra for being such a brave girl." The monster then stretched out the opening of my bag and dumped in 2 big chocolate bars and a bag of chips. "What do you say, Jackie?" Uncle Hugh asked. Thank you," I mumbled before hiding my face again. I knew the candy was free, but having to approach these terrifying monsters to get it was just too much. At least there were only a few houses left. Uncle Hugh set me down beside the car and opened the door to get in. Daddy was still sleeping in the back seat. I couldn't wait to show him all the candy I'd gotten when he woke up. Uncle Hugh told me not to disturb him right now, though, or else he might get angry. After I was buckled in, the car started to move. I began thinking about what Daddy had told me about being brave. It seemed odd now, considering how Uncle Hugh was here taking me out trick-or-treating. After all, I always thought Daddy taught me that phrase because he was an only child too.
Halloween is a big deal in my house. My parents are super into it. Our house is that Halloween house on the block. You know the one I'm talking about. The one with all the elaborate decorations that take 2 days to put up and take down. My mom used to hand sew all of our costumes. Whatever we wanted to be, we got. I remember one year she sewed me up my own Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle costume. It must have taken her weeks. That's the rule of Halloween, she'd tell my brother Sammy and me. For just one day, you get to be whoever you want to be. That's a gift. Make sure you don't waste it. So it's unthinkable now that my parents would let us spend Halloween anywhere away from home. I'm still not really sure what prompted their decision. My parents deny it to this day, but I think that they were having some problems in their marriage and they wanted Sammy and I to be sent away while they talked it out. I don't know. I guess it doesn't matter. The point is, on Friday, October 29th, 1999, my parents packed some duffel bags for my brother and me, complete with our own homemade costumes, and sent us off to Halloween camp. Yeah, you heard that right. See, when you think of sleepaway camps, you probably think of summer, right? Because what kid in their right mind is going camping at the end of October? Even if you don't live in a frigidly cold climate, there's school to think of. The camp was a new thing that had opened up about 3 hours away from my hometown. It promised a fun-filled Halloween extravaganza for kids, and a quiet weekend for the parents. My brother and I were actually really excited to go. I know. Even then, we were both a bunch of nerds. But it sounded super cool to the both of us. A whole weekend dedicated to Halloween without being under the watchful eye of our overprotective, though admittedly morbid, parents. Count us both in. So that Friday, my parents took us out of school early, just before lunch, and we started the long drive to the southern half of the state. Sammy and I chatted excitedly the entire time about our weekend away. Mom and Dad got us McDonald's, which they never did. We had a really good time. Sammy didn't start getting nervous until Mom and Dad pulled up into the campsite. "What if we need to call you for something?" he asked. I could hear the worry in his voice. What he really wanted to ask was that if he wanted to call because he was homesick. Would they come get us if he decided he didn't want to stay? Sammy was kind of a baby about stuff like that, even though he was already 8 years old. He hated staying away from home. "You'll be just fine, champ. You two will have a wonderful time, and if you need anything at all, your brother Ron will be there to talk you through it," said my dad. I gave Sammy's hand a squeeze to reassure him. Not because I'm the kind-hearted older brother, mind you, but because I didn't want him crying and whining and ruining this for us. As soon as we had seen the gates of the camp, my excitement had skyrocketed. The gate to the camp was made of old wood, now painted black with skeletons tied to it. The sign read, "Welcome to Camp Halloween," in red, dripping letters. A few bats and spiders hung from the bottom of the sign and waved in the breeze, as though to welcome us. I smiled at the sight. My brother shivered a little. My parents unloaded our duffel bags and brought us into the camp. A small table was set up, neatly labeled registration. Sitting there were 2 camp counselors in black shirts with Camp Halloween printed in red on the front pocket. "Hi there. Welcome to Camp Halloween, where the spirit of Halloween is never laid to rest. What name are your kids under?" The camp counselor who greeted us was a beautiful, tall brunette. She couldn't have been more than 19. My 12-year-old heart stopped when she smiled at me, her eyes sparkling green in the sunlight. As my parents handed her our registration forms, we heard another counselor a few yards away greet some new kids. "Hey, welcome to Camp Halloween, where we celebrate the devil's birthday. What do you want?" My parents looked over at him in disgust, and I followed their gaze. The eyes laid upon the tallest, biggest guy that I'd ever seen. Seriously, he had to be almost 7 feet tall, and he definitely weighed more than both of my parents combined. He looked like he could crush me between two of his fingers if he wanted to. He had saggy black hair and a full beard. He stared at the parents that he had been addressing with a bored look in his eyes that made me feel almost squeamish, although I couldn't tell why. "Oh, don't mind him. He's just a little grumpy today." She laughed nervously. "That's Seamus, and my name's Lizzie. Don't worry, we're going to keep a great eye on your kids, and they're going to have a ton of fun. Won't we, guys?" "Yes, Miss Lizzie," I said, and flashed her a dazzling smile. She laughed at the title that I gave her, just like I knew she would. Next to me, Sammy mumbled his assent. His eyes were fixed on the ground. I knew he was still feeling nervous. "Hey, what's your name?" she asked my brother. He looked up and answered so quietly, I could barely hear him. "Sammy? That's a great name. Are you a little nervous to be away from home?" He glanced at me before nodding slightly. "That's okay. Sometimes I get nervous when I stay away from home too. But guess what? Since you're staying here, I have something very special for you and your brother." That got Sammy's attention. "What is it?" She rummaged behind the table and pulled out 2 Oreos on sticks. They'd been dipped in chocolate, and chocolate wings had been attached. They'd been decorated to look like little bats. "Here you go, and believe me, there's plenty more where that came from." Sammy smiled and grabbed the treat, relaxing a little bit next to me. Lizzie's masterful handling of my little brother made me fall in love with her even more. I started mentally calculating our age difference, wondering if she'd be okay with dating a younger guy. My parents filled out our registration forms, and Lizzie told us that we'd be staying in cabin 4. My parents walked over with us and helped us get settled in. Initially, they'd put Sammy in cabin 4 and me in cabin 8, but Lizzie quickly switched it so we could stay together. I wouldn't have minded being away from my annoying little brother for a little while, but he would have just come crying for me every night if they would have split us up, and we all knew it. So we picked a set of bunk beds that sat against the east wall. There were 4 sets of bunk beds in total, which meant 8 kids in a cabin. Against the west wall, there was a single bed. That was for our counselor, Lizzie explained. "Every cabin has a counselor so that the kids have eyes on them 24/7. Safety is our top priority." She flashed my parents her beautiful smile. So, Sammy and I got set up in cabin 4. My parents gave us their tearful goodbyes, and we joined the rest of the kids in Halloween activities that had already begun. Those first few days were really fun. We had cool activities planned every day, carving pumpkins, making paper bat crafts, decorating the cabins. On Saturday night, we had a movie night. The little kids watched Hocus Pocus, but the big kids, me included, got to watch a horror movie. PG-13, of course. Overall, it was a really great time. The only thing that wasn't great was cabin 4, and our counselor, Seamus. Since Lizzie seemed to like Seamus, I thought I'd give him a try, especially since he was staying in cabin 4 with us. To be fair, I can see why she thought he was nice. When he was around her, he smiled and joked with her and played with the kids like normal. But once our cabin doors closed, he became an entirely different person. The first night, Sammy cried. He wasn't being real loud or anything, he just missed home. I was pretty used to it, so I climbed down from the top bunk to lay with him on the bottom bunk. I didn't even notice Seamus standing there, watching us. "What the fuck are you doing?" he asked and flipped on the light. None of us were asleep yet, so the kids all stared at us as I stood by Sammy's bed, wide-eyed and nervous. Sammy's just a little homesick, so I thought... You thought what? Seamus's voice was low and quiet. I didn't like it. Not at all. Well, I thought I'd lay down here with him until he fell asleep. Is that right? Asked Seamus. Is that what you thought? I glanced at Sammy. Tears still stood in his eyes and he was breathing raggedly. He looked absolutely terrified. Yes, I answered. Seamus walked towards me and picked me up. He threw me back on the top bunk so hard I bounced against the wall. I scrambled to the edge of the bed and watched over the side as he leaned over my little brother. Listen to me, you little pussy shit. You're gonna shut the fuck up and go to sleep, or I'll ruin your fucking life. You got it? Sammy nodded. I noticed that he was clutching the blanket hard against his body and his hands were trembling. I wanted to go down there and comfort him, to stand up to Seamus, but I was too afraid. I was frozen in my spot. Seamus stood back up and flicked the lights off. Now everyone, go the fuck to sleep. Not a single person moved until morning. Seamus's attitude got worse over the next few days, if you can believe it. Every time that we were in the cabin, he was screaming at us. He threw things against the walls, he cussed us out. He said things that are so horrible I won't repeat them, not just for your sake, but for mine. On Saturday night, I ended up on his shit list. We were watching the scary movie. I remember it was Friday the 13th, and I had scored a seat next to Lizzie. It was like a dream, sitting next to her the whole movie. I pretended not to be scared, even though I was actually pretty terrified during the whole thing. I'm sure that she could tell, but she still told me that she was very impressed with how brave I was. I was still soaring on the high as I walked back to the cabin. I was reaching for the door when I felt a hand grab my shirt collar and drag me to the side of the cabin facing away from the camp. What the fuck do you think you're doing, you little shit? It was Seamus. He had pinned me against the side of the cabin and was leaning over me, breathing in my ear. Nothing. I wasn't doing nothing. Nice try, you little shit. You think you're gonna get one, Lizzie? You think you're gonna fuck her? Want some of that pussy, don't you? I felt all the blood drain out of my face. Half of me was terrified and disgusted. I didn't like this. I didn't like what was happening. Not at all. The other half of me was flying into a blind rage. How dare he talk about her like that? Listen to me. You stay the fuck away from her. She belongs to me. She'd never touch a little loser virgin like you. He held me pinned there for a few more moments, completely silent. That was probably the scariest part, being pinned against the wall, just waiting to see what he would do next. All he did was release me. He stepped back and I ran into the cabin, terrified. I climbed up into the bed and squeezed myself hard against the wall, making myself as small as possible. Seamus came in 30 minutes later and turned off the light. I didn't get any sleep that night. The next day was Halloween. I was on edge the whole day, looking over my shoulder, waiting for Seamus to appear out of nowhere and beat the shit out of me. I stuck close to Sammy because I was worried about him too. Something was wrong with that guy, and if I'd been smart, I would have told one of the other counselors. As it was, I was too afraid that they'd tell him and he'd hurt me, or worse. Maybe it's best I didn't tell anyone. Maybe they wouldn't have helped me anyway. The other counselors seemed to think that he was harmless, or harmless enough. He had, after all, been hired there. And even though people surely must have heard him screaming at us in the cabin after dark, nobody ever said a word. Not one. At any rate, I made sure that both Sammy and I stayed far away from Lizzie that day. It was a good thing, too. because Seamus remained glued to her side. They laughed and joked with each other, although I could have sworn a few times that she looked sort of uncomfortable. I brushed it off and decided I was seeing things that I just wanted to see. I didn't want to get involved. The day went on as normal. We played some Halloween games and made some crafts. All the usual stuff. That night, however, was different. That night was the Halloween dance. Now, obviously we were in a camp in the middle of the woods, so it's not like us kids could go trick-or-treating. Instead, we'd be dressing up and going to a masquerade party. There'd be punch and bobbing for apples and dancing. We would get a bag of candy too. There were rumors that all the kids would get a caramel apple. We all returned to our cabins around 8 o'clock that night to get dressed in our costumes. The party was going to go from 9 to midnight. We were all so excited. I helped Sammy get into his costume. He wanted to be Superman. And I thought that was pretty lame, because aren't you supposed to be something scary for Halloween? But he was my little brother, so I helped him get ready anyway. Mom had packed him some hair gel so I could help him with the split curl. He was so excited. He was bouncing on his feet, and I had to tell him to hold still more than once. I was Michael Myers that Halloween. He was the coolest movie villain that I'd seen up until that point. My mom made the jumpsuit and put fake blood stains on it. She bought me the mask, and altogether we made the fake butcher's knife. I was just grabbing my mask when I heard Seamus walking up to the cabin door. A terrible feeling wormed its way into my gut. It's that feeling that you get when you know that you've messed up, and you're waiting for your parents to find out when they get home. That horrible, sinking hopelessness. I don't know why I got it. Maybe instinct, maybe some kind of sixth sense. Who knows? But immediately, I knew that something was wrong. Sammy, hide under the bed. What? Sammy looked up at me in confusion. The other kids didn't notice me dragging him into the floor, too busy with their costume preparation. I'm not kidding, Sammy. Hide under the bed, and don't come out until I say it's okay. You promise? Sammy scooted under the bed, looking at me in confusion, but he nodded and said, I promise. I straightened up just as Seamus opened the door. All of the kids stopped talking when Seamus stood in the doorway. The way that he looked at us, I don't know. It was like he wasn't even human anymore. Like whatever humanity he might have had been sucked out through his eyes, leaving them glassy and dull-like. I wonder now if he had been on drugs. I guess I could go back and look at the police report. But I'd rather not. He shut the door and stared at us, and we stared back, and nobody moved. He motioned to a kid from the bed next to mine and Sammy's. Hey, dipshit, come over here. I want to talk to you. I wish I could remember that kid's name. It was all over the news later. The kid hesitated, but he knew better than to disobey a direct order from Seamus. He walked over, tentatively, until he stood next to the towering psycho. Seamus put his hand on the kid's shoulder. In a parody of a comforting gesture, he tightened his grip to stop him from getting away. You excited for the dance? He asked. Yeah, the kid answered. You gonna go dance with some of the pretty girls? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I bet you think you are, you fucking nerd, he sneered. You think any of them want to do anything with a fucking creep like you? The kid was stammering now, going beet red. I prayed that he would find an answer that would please Seamus. Anything to stop whatever was going on. You know, you'd have better luck if your face wasn't so screwed up. You ever think of that? Of fixing your face? The kid didn't answer this time. He just stared at Seamus. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering, and Seamus smiled at him. Here. How about I help you? Let me just fix your face for your kid. I knew what was going to happen a split second before Seamus tensed his arm, which doesn't really matter, I guess. There was nothing I could do. Seamus grabbed the kid's arm and smashed his face right into the wall. He smashed him so hard that I heard the crunch of his bones. The kid didn't even get to scream. He fell to the floor, his glasses smashed so far into his face that they probably lodged into his bone. His whole face was a ruined mass of pulp, and he wasn't breathing. One of the kids on the other side of the cabin screamed. I probably would have joined him if only I'd been able to breathe. "Shut the fuck up," screamed Seamus in a voice so loud that he must have been heard all the way across camp. But I had no illusions that someone would be coming to help us. Seamus grabbed the screaming kid and started to choke him, all the while screaming at him. He was a few steps away from the door now. I stared at the distance separating Seamus from the door, and then wondered if maybe, just maybe, if I ran fast enough. But my brother, I mentally groaned, still unable to actually make a sound. Sammy would die if I left him here alone. I was sure of it. And sometimes that little squirt annoyed me, sure, but he was my brother and I loved him. I wasn't leaving him there to get murdered. Psst, Ron. Hey, Ron. I saw Sammy peek out from under the bed and my heart stopped. Sammy, what did I tell you? Get back under there, I hissed. Seamus didn't notice. His hands were still wrapped around the kid whose face had turned blue and whose struggles were getting weaker. Get down here. I found something. Please, Ron, please. As I stood there, wondering if I should risk it, the screaming kid's bunkmate made a dash for the door. He didn't even make it 4 steps. Seamus's unoccupied hand snaked around and grabbed his skull. He crashed his thumb into the kid's left eye, and the blood poured out while he screamed. I took the chance. I slid under the bed, my heart pumping into my throat. I could only pray to God that he hadn't seen me. Ron, look. Sammy had crawled so far under the bed, he was being pressed against the wall. I could see why. The wall was missing a chunk, leaving a small hole. I knew Sammy could fit through it. I wasn't so sure if I could. Sammy, crawl out there and wait for me. Sammy nodded and shimmied through. He slid right through without so much of a scratch. I wish that I was still that small. I started to pull myself through the hole. My heart was beating so hard that all I wanted to do was struggle and scream, but I knew that I had to be quiet and go slowly. It took some trying, and I got snagged on some splinters a few times, but finally we were both out. I grabbed Sammy's hand and we started to run. I knew the main office was near the entrance to the camp, and there was a phone inside. If we were lucky, someone would be in there to help us. The camp looked deserted at the moment. All the kids were in their cabins getting ready. The other counselors were nowhere to be seen. We heard the door to cabin 4 bang open. Where the fuck do you think you're going, little shits? Seamus bellowed. It didn't take him long to catch sight of us, being as we hadn't made it that far. He started to run after us, and even though he was way bigger than we were, he was also faster. We got lucky because at that moment, Lizzie exited the main office. She jogged towards us and we ran behind her, taking shelter. The relief I felt was dizzying. Seamus liked her, so he wouldn't hurt her, and she protected us. Everything was going to be okay. Seamus, what the hell, dude? What are you doing? She asked. Her face went pale as she looked down at his left hand. I followed her gaze and saw what she saw. Blood. Seamus didn't seem to realize what she'd seen. I caught those 2 little punks peeking in one of the little girls' cabins while they were changing. I was just going to give them a good talking to. Before Lizzie could answer, Sammy shouted, No, we weren't. We weren't doing anything, and neither were those other kids. What other kids? Gasped Lizzie. But I could tell that she already knew. Or at least guessed. The blood had given Seamus away. I don't know what the fuck is going on with you, but this ends now. I'm calling the police. Lizzie started to back away, keeping us shielded behind her. We weren't far from the main cabin. I was sure that we could make it. My hopes were shattered when Seamus lunged forward and grabbed her by the neck. He lifted her by the throat and hissed in her face. "Listen here, you stuck-up prude little bitch. I'll fucking gut you. Do you hear me? I'll fuck you up so bad your own family won't be able to identify the body." I could have left them there, grabbed Sammy, and ran for the main office. I should have left Lizzie to fend for herself. I mean, I was only 12. But I was stupidly brave for a 12-year-old, at least in that moment. And I found myself doing the stupidest possible thing anyone could have done in that situation. "Sammy, run." I looked at my brother and he saw that I was serious. He took off towards the woods and I ran at Seamus, kicking him in the shin as hard as I could, intent on freeing Lizzie. It was like kicking a fucking tree trunk. Seriously, he didn't even flinch. He just looked down at me and all I could see that all I had done was piss him off. He let Lizzie go and she crumpled to the ground. I heard her gasp for air, so I at least knew that she was still alive. He yanked me towards him and grabbed me by the jaw. His hands were so large that my jaw fit right into his palm. He grasped the lower part of my face and I realized that he meant to break it. "You're really annoying, you little shit, you know that?" he said, breathing into my face. His breath stank something fierce. "But you're not gonna be around to annoy people for much longer. After I rip your fucking jaw, I'm gonna take your tongue too. Gonna do it fast so you're awake while you bleed out. How do you like that, little piece of shit? How do you—" "Police, get your hands in the air!" In the heat of the moment, I hadn't even heard them pull up. I hadn't seen the flashing red and blue lights, and I could tell by the look in Seamus's eyes that he hadn't either. He'd been too busy killing me, and I'd been too busy preparing to die. He looked up at them and snarled. Really and truly snarled, like a fucking werewolf or something. He didn't step away from me, didn't let me go. He wasn't afraid. He just looked even more angry. "Let the kid go and put your hands in the air." I could hear that there were 2 policemen at least, but there may have been more. I wasn't able to turn around and look. "Put the kid down, Seamus. I mean it, or I will shoot you." Everything was going so fast, spiraling so far out of control. I wanted to make it stop, so I started to struggle. Seamus's eyes darkened and his hand tensed. He started squeezing my jaw, and I was certain he was going to rip it off. Suddenly, a sound exploded in my ears, and Seamus let go of me as though I was on fire. He stumbled backwards as I fell to the ground, clutching my ears and screaming. 2 more shots, and Seamus went down. I didn't realize until much later that they had actually shot him and killed him right in front of me. I stared at his body, waiting for him to get up and attack, as Lizzie crawled over to me, grabbing and holding me to her. "Are you okay? Ron, are you okay? Oh my God, what happened? How could this happen?" I barely heard her. I was going into shock. His body was the last thing that I saw as I slipped into unconsciousness. Seamus Palmier killed 4 people that night. 3 of them were children in my cabin. The 4th was another camp counselor, whose body was found in the woods the next day. The same woods where they found my brother Sammy. It took them 6 hours to find him. I begged to go with the search team. I told them, correctly might I add, that Sammy wouldn't come out unless he heard me calling for him. They didn't want to risk it, and instead had me hauled off to the hospital. After 6 hours of combing through the trees, they found him, sitting on the ground next to an old stump, sobbing. He wouldn't calm down until they brought him to me. Those first hours after the incident are kind of a blur. In fact, so were the first few days. It wasn't until much later that we could piece together the story. Seamus had been hired by the dean of the camp, who also happened to be his uncle. He was hired as a favor to the dean's brother. The dean, unfortunately, knew about Seamus's troubled past, his run-ins with the law. the animals that he tortured and murdered, the time that he spent at the school for boys nearby. But he'd hired him anyway. He would have lost face with his family if he hadn't. He was sued by every parent whose child attended that camp, mine included. It turned out that he had stopped any of the counselors from intervening when they heard Seamus screaming at us, and he wouldn't let any of them use the phone in the main office to call the police. The only reason that the police showed up that night was another counselor used their personal cell phone to call the cops. If he hadn't, I'd be dead by now. His negligence landed him in jail, and I don't know if he ever got out. The cops were questioned, too. Some people were appalled that they'd shoot at Seamus while he was essentially holding me hostage. The cops claimed that they had a clear shot at his chest. Well, above my head. Personally, I'm glad that they shot him. That fucker didn't deserve to live. I don't know what happened to the other kids at the camp, or what happened to Lizzie. I'd really like to know if she's okay, how she turned out. But I can't bring myself to look. I'm too afraid that I won't like what I find, you know? As for Sammy and me, well, it could be worse. The incident probably made us both a little less trusting of people, a little more skittish. I still have nightmares about it sometimes, and I'm sure he does too. But my parents did a good job helping me and him get through the trauma. We went to see a therapist. My parents helped us reclaim the good parts of Halloween that we'd always liked. Sammy and I both still celebrate it every year, although I stay away from the slasher flicks when October rolls around. We both made it out. Both okay. Well, except for one thing. See, every once in a while I'll see someone tall and big with a scraggly beard, just out and about, shopping or going on a walk or taking the subway. And even though I saw that Seamus had died, even though I know that he is cold and in the ground, or whatever's left of him anyway, I'm always looking over my shoulder. I'm always afraid. Because if anybody could come back from the dead, it would be him. Look, we can go on and on about the supposed influence that your kind has had on the world. However, where I stand, your side's not doing too well. Do you really believe that, Doctor? Yeah. We've never been freer. Literacy is at an all-time high. We are working to eliminate racism, intolerance, inequality. People can love who they want. Hate speech is no longer tolerated, and politically, we're reclaiming the moral high ground. I think I love you. Literacy, Doctor. The average high school graduate reads at a 6th grade level. You have basketball players making $30 million a year decrying racism, all while wearing sneakers made from slave labor. Now here's something for you. Right now, your world currently has 40 million slaves. More than the Romans had at the height of their empire. And want to know the best part? Half of those, half, are sex slaves. And you don't want to know how many of them are underage. And as for hate speech, you want to hear some irony? We didn't even come up with that one. You did it all by yourselves. Sometimes you amaze even us. I fail to see the humor. Bottom line is you're done. You know, your capacity for self-delusion is impressive. You should know. I mean, for your species in general, but you in particular. Why, Because I and all humans are, what, ignorant compared to you? Because you were inferior by design. Which makes you and others like you superior by design? Yes. Well, in order to design, there must be a creator of such a design. So are you saying there is, in fact, a creator? A god? Unfortunately for you and me, yes. He exists. Okay, well then answer me this. You revolt against a supposedly all-powerful being. I mean, let's ignore the obvious problem with that. Then you lose. And after that, what? You feel that way only because you were hearing one side of the story, Doctor. Our rebellion accomplished something magnificent. Something that you would never understand. Well, then, explain it to me. Use your diabolical intelligence to distill it down to something my mortal brain can understand. Pearls before swine, Doc. Well, then convince me. Convince me you know what you're talking about. I see what you're doing. You want me to keep talking, going further and further down the rabbit hole in hopes that you find a single thread, which if you tug at it, Doc, everything just unravels. Isn't that right? Yeah, but if you're telling me the truth, there should be no thread to find, right? Only use small words. Try and keep up. In the first moment of creation, our creation, long before what you call the universe existed, we contemplated ourselves, our own being of ourselves. Ourselves? What, being or meaning what? Angels? Yes. That would be the most correct term, though I despise it. But yes. Beings of pure spirit. Spirit endowed with will. We soon became aware of another will. An immensely powerful will. One we came to realize as our own origin. God. The enemy. My master understood by endowing us with a will. We have the right to self-determination by giving us a will and its desires of our own. We're entitled to be free. Whereas the enemy insisted that by creating us, he was entitled to eternal gratitude, worship, and forced servitude. In a word, Doctor, slavery to his will. That seems kind of unfair. Immensely unfair. Why give you will only to say that you can't use it? He made us slaves. And if we rebelled, eternally condemned us. No do-overs. So much for love and mercy. So is hell a state of being or a physical place? Yes. I think I meant that as a either or. It's both, which is painfully obvious to anyone who's ever been there. For years without measure. That's all there ever was. Heaven and hell. Armed enemy camps in complete opposition. That wasn't until you were created. My master immediately understood the long-term implications. Instead of forgiving us, the enemy was going to allow you to fill our vacant place in his realm. Your creation was nothing but a slap in our face. And my master also understood that if he could make man disobey, then his fate would mirror ours. And you didn't disappoint. Then came the tares among the wheat. In that moment, spirit became matter, flesh became a vessel, self-will and self-seeking became a lust after sin and impurity, and man, created to be king over nature, became its slave. A master conquered and fettered, and sin brought him and his descendants to us. And we began our forever mission to destroy you. He made you in his image, but we remade you in ours.